I never thought a simple Sunday morning could feel like a scene from a high-stakes thriller. My name is Ethan Brooks, and normally, my life is made up of greasy garages, sunburnt weekends at local car meets, and the occasional late-night pizza binge. But today, none of that mattered. Today, I was headed to meet Lillian's family. Lillian, the girl I'd been falling for hard these past 6 months. Her family wasn't just rich. They were the sort of people who seemed to exist in another world entirely. Their weekends were spent on private estates, charity galas, and yacht shows, while my life revolved around oil-stained coveralls and hand-worn wrenches. The morning had started like any other. I brewed a strong black coffee, checked the engine of my 1967 Mustang one last time, and loaded my carefully pressed suit into the passenger seat. It was my only one, a charcoal grey number I had bought after my first big paycheck, and I had ironed it with the precision of a surgeon preparing for a major operation. The stakes today felt even higher. Lillian had warned me repeatedly. Her parents didn't just dislike mediocrity. They looked down on anyone whose life didn't sparkle with inherited wealth and effortless charm. I swallowed hard, trying to convince myself that charm was something you could fake. The drive out of the city was deceptively calm. Tall glass buildings gave way to neighborhoods of sprawling lawns and tennis courts, and soon, the streets narrowed into winding lanes flanked by perfectly trimmed hedges. I glanced at the rearview mirror, checking the time. I was right on schedule. Maybe, just maybe, I could pull this off. Then I saw it. A glint of silver on the shoulder of the road caught my eye, a flash of elegance amid the green. I slowed as I approached, and my stomach dropped. It was a car, but not just any car. It was a vintage Bentley, its hood propped open and a thin wisp of smoke curling into the morning air. Beside it stood an elderly woman, hands on her hips, surveying the engine with a look of sheer exasperation. Her hair was a perfect silver, styled impeccably, and pearls glimmered in the sunlight. I knew instantly that if I passed her by, I'd regret it forever. Something in me, a mixture of instinct and pride, told me to stop. I pulled over, keeping my foot on the brake longer than necessary, as though hesitation could somehow soften what was about to happen. The woman looked up at me as I stepped out of my car, adjusting my suit jacket. She was surveying me, her eyes sharp and assessing, and I could feel her curiosity before she spoke. She needed help. And in that moment, all my rehearsed speeches about sophistication and wealth melted away. The only thing that mattered was fixing what was broken. I opened the hood, the familiar scent of warm oil and metal washing over me like a comforting, chaotic perfume. My hands itched for the tools I always carried in my Mustang. This wasn't just a car. It was a challenge, a puzzle that I could solve with skill and patience. And so I got to work, stripping a frayed wire, reconnecting circuits, and whispering soft apologies to the machinery as if coaxing it back to life. By the time the Bentley roared back to a smooth, purring hum, I looked at my hands. Black grease streaked my fingers and palms, climbing up my cuffs and staining the pristine suit I had spent the last hour preparing. I glanced at my watch. An hour late. The mansion awaited, and I was heading there in the state I had feared most. Unpolished, imperfect, undeniably human. I slid back into my car, hands still blackened, and took a deep breath. This was it, the meeting that could define not only my relationship, but how Lillian's family would perceive me forever. I drove the final stretch along a long, winding driveway flanked by towering oaks and meticulously pruned rose bushes. There it was, the estate. Massive, imposing, and unmistakably a fortress of old money. My stomach churned. I rehearsed my apology as I walked up the stone path, imagining every possible reaction, every disappointed look, every subtle sneer. And then, finally, I rang the bell. Silence. For a moment, my heartbeat was the loudest sound in the universe. Then the door opened, and there was Lillian, standing as though carved from marble, her eyes widening as they took in the suit, the grease, the dirt, the disaster I had become. "Oh my God, Ethan," she whispered. And I knew, right then, that surviving this evening would require more than charm. It would demand courage, skill, and a little unexpected luck. Standing at the threshold, my heart pounded like a drum in a battlefield. Lillian's eyes, wide, almost painfully beautiful, tried to convey reassurance, but all I could feel was the weight of the mansion behind her. The walls were tall and imposing, each window reflecting sunlight like it was a polished jewel. The door itself seemed carved from some ancient tree, dark and immovable. I realized then that it wasn't just the building I had to overcome. It was the entire world her family represented. I stepped inside, and the air hit me differently than the morning breeze. It was cooler, heavy with the scent of polished wood, rare perfume, and a faint tang of aged wine. The foyer stretched endlessly, marble floors glistening under a golden chandelier that seemed to hang suspended in time. Each footstep I took sounded like a small betrayal of the quiet elegance around me. My hands, still streaked with black grease, felt like a neon sign screaming incompetence. Then I saw them. Her parents. Mr. and Mrs. Harrington. Lillian had described them, but nothing could have prepared me for the reality. Richard Harrington was tall, with silver hair slicked back, a face carved with lines of authority and disdain, dressed in a suit that could have been stitched from moonlight itself. Beside him, Eleanor Harrington moved like she was floating above the floor, a queen among mere mortals, every pearl and diamond reflecting light in a way that seemed almost mocking. They stopped, and the room fell into a silence so thick I could almost taste it. I opened my mouth to speak, rehearsed lines of apology, rehearsed 1,000 times in my head, but none of them came out right. My voice emerged as a low, hoarse rumble, uneven and nervous. I am so sorry for being late. There was an emergency on the road. I couldn't leave." Richard Harrington lifted a hand, sharp and commanding, slicing through my words like a knife. "We are aware of excuses, young man," he said, his voice flat but cutting. "But punctuality is not a request. It is a baseline requirement." Eleanor's eyes swept over me, landing with cruel precision on my grease-stained hands, the slightly rumpled sleeves of my suit, the faint streaks of black across my shoes. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips, a predator's smirk. It wasn't cruel, exactly. It was a judgment refined over decades, honed like a blade. And I, greasy, tired, and thoroughly human, was standing right in its path. I felt Lillian squeeze my arm lightly, a small anchor in the storm. She had warned me, yes, but nothing could have prepared me for the full force of old money contempt. Every story she'd whispered about their precision, their perfectionism, their ability to reduce a person to a mere object of critique flashed in my mind. And now, there I was, a mechanic, a man whose hands carried the proof of his life's work, standing before two of the most intimidating figures I had ever encountered. I tried to regain some composure, straightening my posture, willing my hands not to tremble. The silence dragged, stretched, and twisted around me like a living thing. And then, without warning, they both stepped back in unison, a calculated retreat that seemed almost choreographed. Lillian looked stricken, her lips parted in silent worry, and I felt the weight of every expectation, every social rule, pressing down on me like a vice. But before the conversation could descend into complete disaster, a sound cut through the tension, a low, familiar hum of an engine, steady, deep, and undeniably commanding. My stomach flipped as recognition hit me. The Bentley. The elderly woman I had helped on the road was here. Moments later, the large double doors at the side of the foyer opened. She entered with the same elegance she had exuded on the roadside, every movement controlled and deliberate. The matriarch of the Harrington family, Lillian's grandmother, was nothing short of formidable. Her eyes, pale blue and keenly intelligent, swept the room like a judge in a courtroom. Then, slowly, they fixed on me. I felt examined, assessed, and finally, acknowledged. She walked toward me, each step deliberate, radiating a power that seemed to bend the very air. "I hear there was a problem on the road," she said, her voice low, precise, but not unkind. "And that you fixed it." I swallowed, suddenly aware of the grease on my hands, the rumpled suit, and the dirt smeared across my shoes. But there was something in her gaze, a recognition of skill and intent, that emboldened me. "Yes, ma'am," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. It needed attention. I couldn't leave it like that." She smiled. Not a small, polite smile, but a full, knowing smile, the kind that carries a subtle weight of approval. The room seemed to shift, the chill of the Harrington's judgment melting slightly under her authority. Lillian's parents, once cold and unyielding, now looked uncertain, as if the matriarch's attention had pulled the floor from beneath them. It was an unexpected pivot, a change I hadn't dared hope for. I realized then that my worth, my talent, my character, was being measured not by the suit I wore or the stains on my hands, but by the actions I took, the decisions I made when no one was watching. And in that moment, the story changed, not just for me, but for everyone in that room. I felt Lillian's hand tighten on my arm again, a silent gesture of pride, and I knew that whatever came next, I was no longer the outsider desperately trying to fit in. I was noticed, and perhaps, finally, I was understood. The grand dining room smelled of beeswax, polished oak, and faint traces of roasting duck. I had entered the room with my hands still streaked with grease, my suit carrying the evidence of the morning's emergency, and yet, it was as if the air itself had shifted. Every chair, every ornate detail of the room, screamed of centuries of wealth and authority. And at the center of it all sat Matilda Harrington, the matriarch who had just redefined my life in mere moments. She gestured to the chair at the head of the table, a position I had imagined only in dreams, reserved for kings or visiting dignitaries, and indicated for me to sit. My stomach turned. This wasn't merely a seat. It was a statement. Lillian's parents had gone from judges to spectators. Their authority diminished the instant Matilda arrived. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, a mechanic, an unpolished man with grease on my hands, being invited to the center of their world. The table was immense, long enough that I could barely see its end without craning my neck. Every setting gleamed with silverware polished to perfection, crystal glasses catching the light like prisms. The first course was served, a delicate soup that smelled of fresh herbs and subtle spices. I lifted my spoon cautiously, mindful of the exact placement of each utensil, aware that any slip would be a spectacle for Lillian's family. And then Matilda spoke. Not to me directly, but in a tone that commanded attention. "The value of a person," she said, her voice clear and resonant, "cannot be measured in wealth, nor in the eloquence of their speech. It is measured in their deeds. Actions taken when no one is watching, choices made under pressure, integrity maintained in moments of chaos." I realized immediately she was referring to the morning, to the Bentley, to the grease-stained hands she had inspected so keenly. I nodded subtly, unsure if my gesture would meet the expectations of this new social hierarchy. She continued, her gaze sweeping the room, lingering on my hands for just a moment longer. "I have observed a young man this morning who did not hesitate to act when confronted with a dilemma that required both skill and courage. That is rare. That is precious. And that is what this family has long struggled to recognize in its younger generation." Richard Harrington shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his pride bruised, his authority subtly undermined. Eleanor's eyes narrowed, calculating, trying to reassert some dominance in a space now dominated by her mother's presence. But Matilda was resolute. She had taken the lead in this narrative, and she intended to carry it forward. Dinner progressed, each course a silent ritual of elegance, and I found myself relaxing, answering questions about the cars I worked on, about the restoration projects I had undertaken, and even about the small business I had built from nothing. Matilda listened intently, asking sharp questions that tested both my knowledge and my integrity. She inquired about the challenges I faced, the ethical decisions I had made in my work, and the lessons I had learned through hands-on experience. At one point, Richard attempted to interject, speaking about investments and market values, his tone forceful. Matilda raised a hand without looking at him. "This evening," she said smoothly, "we discuss value that can be touched, felt, and understood, not abstract numbers on a screen. Mark builds things that last, things that matter, and he does so with his own hands and mind. That is what I am interested in tonight." Eleanor tried again, mentioning art collections and rare wines, attempting to draw the conversation back to the realm she controlled. Matilda, however, remained unwavering, her focus absolute. I was the center, not because I had wealth, not because I had status, but because I had proven myself through action and character. I realized, in that moment, that this was more than a dinner. It was a test, not of etiquette, not of charm, but of authenticity. Matilda Harrington had crafted an unspoken challenge for me. Could I navigate the world of the privileged, maintain my dignity, and assert my worth without compromising who I was? As the main course arrived, a perfectly roasted duck with golden skin and aromatic herbs, Matilda leaned slightly toward me, her eyes holding a spark of curiosity and approval. "Tell me," she said, "when faced with a choice between convenience and doing what is right, which do you choose?" I felt the weight of the question, but it was simple in its essence. I answered honestly, recounting the morning, the elderly woman on the side of the road, the decision to stop even though it meant risking my own schedule and appearance. "I choose what is right," I said quietly but firmly. "Even if it costs me something, even if no one else notices, it is still the correct path." Matilda's smile widened, subtle but unmistakable. The room, once thick with tension, now carried a different energy. Respect had been earned, quietly, without fanfare. Lillian's parents, formidable as they were, now faced a truth they could neither refute nor ignore. The young man before them, greasy hands and all, possessed a character that transcended social convention. By the time dessert was served, a delicate confection of chocolate and berries, the tone of the evening had shifted entirely. Matilda engaged me in conversation about my dreams, my ambitions, and the plans I had for my life. Her questions were probing, insightful, and utterly sincere. I spoke freely, my confidence growing, feeling that my worth was finally being recognized on a level deeper than surface appearances. As the evening drew toward its close, I realized the full magnitude of what had occurred. The matriarch of this family, the woman who commanded respect effortlessly, had not only acknowledged my abilities but had positioned me as an equal, at least for the duration of this meal. Lillian's parents had been humbled, subtly but completely, witnessing the triumph of action over superficial judgment. The final sip of wine, deep and resonant, marked more than the end of the meal. It was the culmination of a quiet victory. I had survived their scrutiny, proven my integrity, and earned the respect of the one person whose judgment truly mattered in that room. Matilda Harrington, in her understated brilliance, had orchestrated an unspoken acknowledgement. The measure of a man was not in wealth or appearance, but in the courage to act rightly, the skill to execute effectively, and the integrity to maintain one's principles even under pressure. And tonight, for the first time in my life, I had walked into a world not of my making and left a mark on it, undeniable and lasting. After dessert, the room had settled into a strange, almost reverent quiet. Lillian's parents, Richard and Eleanor Harrington, seemed to shrink into their chairs, their earlier arrogance muted by the force of Matilda's presence. And yet, despite their shock, the young woman I had come to know as Lillian approached me, her face softening with an expression I had never seen before, a mixture of relief, pride, and something almost vulnerable. We stood slightly apart from the table, a subtle island in the grand room, away from the rigid structure of silverware and crystal. "Hi. I didn't think you would survive that dinner," Lillian said quietly, her voice tinged with awe. "I mean, Matilda's approval it's no small thing. And yet, here you are." I smiled, though it was careful, acknowledging both the weight of her words and the surreal nature of the evening. "I didn't survive because of me," I said. "I survived because of what I did this morning. Helping that woman, fixing her car. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was just the right thing to do." Lillian's eyes sparkled, and for the first time, I noticed the subtle shift in her posture. She stood taller, more confident, as if seeing me in that light allowed her to reclaim a part of herself that had been trapped under the weight of her family's expectations. "You didn't know it, but you've already won," she whispered. "Matilda, she doesn't just respect skill. She respects integrity, and tonight, she's made that clear to everyone." Her words were soothing, yet electrifying. There was a rare intensity in her presence, a silent acknowledgement that the world outside this room, of privilege, wealth, and expectation, was suddenly irrelevant. We walked together toward a large window overlooking the estate, where the late evening sun cast the manicured lawns in hues of gold and rose. The soft rustle of leaves and the distant clatter of fountains created a surreal soundtrack to our whispered conversation. "You know," Lillian began, her voice playful but tinged with seriousness, "I always worried that introducing you to my family would ruin everything, that you'd be crushed under their expectations, or worse, that they'd crush me. But tonight, it's different. They've been reminded that there's more to life than appearances. And somehow, you've become the catalyst for that change." I laughed quietly, the sound echoing faintly against the marble walls. "A catalyst? I was just fixing a car, Lillian. That's all. But I suppose in their world, action speaks louder than any amount of wealth or influence." She turned to look at me, her eyes reflecting a mix of curiosity and admiration. "And what about you?" she asked softly. "Do you feel changed by tonight? Or is this just another moment in your life that will fade?" I paused, considering her question. "I feel different," I admitted, "not because of them, or their approval, but because for the first time someone, Matilda, saw me for who I am, not who I should be. And that kind of recognition, it changes you. It makes you realize that the right choices matter, even if they come with risk." Lillian smiled, a delicate, knowing smile. "Then maybe we've just begun something new," she said, her hand brushing briefly against mine. It was a fleeting touch, yet it carried an intensity that neither of us needed to define. It was a promise of trust, a quiet pact forged in the shadow of a world that had long valued only the superficial. Meanwhile, the dinner had left a ripple through the household. Richard Harrington's pride had been wounded beyond repair, his attempts at dominance neutralized by the matriarch's clear judgment. Eleanor, elegant and sharp as ever, had been forced to reconcile her own values with the undeniable merit of my actions. They watched us from across the room, the unspoken acknowledgement of their humbled state hanging thick in the air. Matilda, ever composed, seemed to regard the entire scene with amusement. Her gaze, sharp and calculating, softened as she observed Lillian and me. There was a subtle nod, almost imperceptible, that felt like an official endorsement, a transfer of trust and recognition from matriarch to the young man who had dared to act rightly. The night stretched on. Coffee and a fine selection of after-dinner cognac were served. I remained at the table, Matilda's questions evolving into discussions about craftsmanship, ethics, and the enduring value of skill. Richard and Eleanor remained largely silent, watching the dynamic unfold, occasionally exchanging glances that betrayed a mixture of disbelief and grudging respect. As the final moments of the evening approached, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. I had entered this world a stranger, unpolished and unproven, and yet I had emerged with the recognition of the family's matriarch, the admiration of Lillian, and a subtle but powerful shift in the household's balance of power. It was a victory defined not by wealth or charm, but by character, action, and integrity. Stepping out onto the balcony to catch a breath of the cool night air, I gazed at the sprawling estate below, the perfectly lit gardens, the fountains, and the endless avenues of trimmed hedges. Lillian joined me, standing silently at my side, her presence a steady reassurance amidst the surreal grandeur. "This," she said quietly, "is only the beginning. If tonight is any indication, I think we might just be unstoppable together." I smiled, feeling the weight of her words and the possibilities they carried. "Unstoppable," I repeated, letting the words settle. The night was young, the air crisp, and the world, for the first time in a long while, felt full of promise, not just for me, but for what we could build together. Morning arrived like a gentle reprimand, the golden light spilling across the sprawling Harrington estate, highlighting every perfectly trimmed hedge, every marble fountain, and every line of the Georgian mansion's impeccable brickwork. I woke in the guest suite Matilda had generously offered me the previous night, a room that felt more like a small palace than a mere bedroom. The sheets smelled faintly of lavender and linen, a stark contrast to the grease-stained suit I had abandoned hours earlier. My body ached in a way that reminded me of every long day spent in my garage. Muscles stiff, hands still carrying the faint scent of oil despite my best attempts at scrubbing the night before. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the lingering haze of adrenaline and disbelief. Last night had been surreal, an exercise in tension, anxiety, and ultimate vindication. I had faced the Harringtons' judgment, survived it, and somehow emerged with Matilda's approval. And yet, the morning brought a new set of uncertainties. Stepping into the suite's bathroom, I caught my reflection in the mirror. My hair was mussed, my face carried the ghost of last night's nervous energy, and my hands, thankfully, were finally clean. I ran a hand over my jawline, taking a deep breath. Today would be a different challenge. Matilda had promised me an opportunity, but she had been vague. There was a weight to her words, a sense of something grand and undefined that I would soon have to confront. Downstairs, the house was already stirring. The sounds of morning rituals, coffee brewing, silverware clinking, quiet conversations, filled the hallways. Lillian had gone ahead to tend to the household's morning affairs, her presence a stabilizing force in a home that, for all its grandeur, could easily overwhelm anyone unprepared. I followed cautiously, aware of the delicate balance I was still walking. Richard and Eleanor Harrington were in the breakfast room, seated stiffly at a long mahogany table. Their expressions were a mixture of resentment, disbelief, and a strange new caution. They had seen a glimpse of power beyond their control, the quiet authority Matilda wielded, and in the presence of that authority, they were uncertain how to proceed. Matilda entered with the effortless grace that seemed to command every space she occupied. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, briefly met mine. That look alone reminded me why she was the matriarch, the one who could bend even the most rigid spirits without a word. "Good morning," she said, her voice calm yet imbued with a strength that brooked no opposition. "I trust you slept well, Mr. Callahan?" I nodded, managing a polite smile. "Yes, thank you, ma'am." "Very well." She inclined her head slightly, an acknowledgement of my respect and composure. "Last night was a demonstration," she said, almost cryptically, "of character, skill, and courage, all of which, I believe, are undervalued qualities in this household." Her gaze swept the room, lingering on her children with an unspoken reprimand. "I have a proposition for you, Mr. Callahan, one that will require continued integrity, judgment, and a willingness to act where others hesitate." I felt a pulse of excitement mixed with apprehension. "I'm listening, ma'am," I said, careful not to betray the anticipation building inside me. She smiled, a subtle, knowing curl of her lips. "There is a project, a restoration of a property that has long been neglected. It belongs to the Harrington family, though it has fallen into disrepair due to bureaucratic neglect and the careless oversight of its administrators. I want you to oversee its restoration, not as an employee, not as a mere contractor, but as the guiding hand that will transform it into something worthy of the family name." My mind raced. The opportunity was unprecedented. Not only was it a chance to prove my skills on a scale I had never imagined, but it also came with a tacit endorsement of Matilda herself. And yet, the weight of expectation loomed heavily. This was not merely a mechanical task. It was a test of judgment, diplomacy, and vision. Richard Harrington's face darkened. His pride, already bruised from last night's events, struggled against the reality unfolding before him. Eleanor's sharp gaze was tinged with frustration, a recognition that the matriarch's decision placed her children in the shadows, at least temporarily. They exchanged a glance that spoke volumes, resistance, resentment, and begrudging acceptance coexisting uneasily. Matilda continued, her tone measured but firm. "You will have access to resources, guidance where necessary, and complete autonomy in decision-making. Your task is simple in principle, though challenging in execution. Restore the estate to its former glory, honoring both its history and its potential." The enormity of the task settled on me like a physical weight. I felt both exhilaration and trepidation. This was more than a restoration. It was a test of character and skill, magnified by the presence of those who could either validate or undermine every decision I made. And yet, I sensed a profound opportunity, not only to demonstrate competence, but to redefine the Harrington family's perception of value and labor. "Of course, ma'am," I said, voice steady though my heart raced. "I won't disappoint you." Her eyes, sharp and discerning, seemed to pierce through any remaining hesitation. "I do not expect disappointment, Mr. Callahan. I expect excellence." She turned, her presence leaving a residual gravity in the room, as if the air itself recognized her authority. Lillian approached, her smile quiet but full of assurance. "You can do this," she said, her hand brushing against mine. "I believe in you, more than anyone in this house ever could." I smiled, the warmth of her support bolstering the resolve already growing within me. Together, we walked through the estate grounds, Matilda providing subtle guidance, while I envisioned the transformation that awaited. Every cracked column, every overgrown hedge, every faded wall presented a challenge, a chance to demonstrate not just skill, but vision, ingenuity, and care. As the morning sun climbed higher, bathing the estate in light, I felt the weight of opportunity settling firmly on my shoulders. The journey ahead would be arduous, filled with scrutiny, expectation, and unforeseen challenges. But for the first time in my life, I felt the rare and invigorating mix of fear and excitement, knowing that every decision, every act, would shape not only the property, but the perception of who I was and what I could achieve. And in that moment, with Lillian by my side and Matilda's quiet confidence behind me, I understood that the night's dinner was only the beginning. The real trial, the true measure of my worth, was just beginning. And this time, the stakes were higher, the rewards far greater, and the consequences impossible to ignore. The morning air was crisp as I approached the neglected estate, the vast property stretching further than I had imagined the previous night. Once a jewel of the Harrington holdings, the main house now stood like a sleeping giant, its grandeur veiled beneath layers of dust, ivy, and the silent weight of decades of neglect. Every step I took on the gravel path seemed to echo against the empty walls, a quiet reminder that this project would demand not only skill but endurance and patience. I parked my pickup truck near the carriage house, the vehicle's well-oiled engine purring in contrast to the silence that greeted me. A gust of wind sent leaves skittering across the yard, and I could almost hear the faint groan of the house itself, as though the bricks were whispering complaints accumulated over decades. Matilda had promised autonomy, but as I stood there, surveying the sprawling property, the responsibility pressed down on me like a physical weight. My first inspection took me to the main house's exterior. Cracked columns, chipped paint, broken window panes, all spoke to years of deferred maintenance and overlooked problems. I ran my hands along the weathered railing, feeling splinters bite into my palms, a stark reminder that restoration was not about elegance alone. It was about confronting the reality of decay, one detail at a time. The carriage house presented its own challenges. Roof beams sagged under the weight of years. Tools and remnants of forgotten projects lay scattered across the dusty floor. I bent to inspect the main support beams and felt the wood give slightly beneath my fingers. My heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just aesthetic work. Structural integrity was at stake. I noted each area requiring immediate attention, mentally cataloguing the repairs in order of priority. Matilda arrived mid-morning, as though she had silently monitored my initial survey. Her presence carried the quiet authority of someone used to orchestrating outcomes without uttering unnecessary words. "You have a good eye," she said simply, gesturing toward the cracked facade. Many would have walked past these issues, dismissing them as minor. But true restoration begins with acknowledgement. I nodded, absorbing both the compliment and the responsibility it implied. Her eyes scanned the property, sharp and calculating. "There will be setbacks," she continued. "Unforeseen problems, budgetary constraints, perhaps resistance from those who think they know better. You must anticipate them and act decisively." Indeed, no sooner had she left than the first setback emerged. The main water pump, hidden beneath a collapsed section of the foundation, refused to operate. Rust had eaten through its valves, and the electrical system controlling it was a tangle of frayed wires. I knelt beside it, hands trembling slightly with the excitement and anxiety that always accompanied mechanical challenges. This was not the Rolls-Royce on the side of a country road. This was the heart of the estate, and failure here would echo far beyond a single vehicle. Hours passed in a blur of tools, sweat, and determination. Each repaired pipe, each rewired connection felt like a minor victory, yet the estate's size reminded me that this was only the beginning. By midday, the sun had risen high enough to cast harsh shadows across the grounds, making every flaw more visible, every imperfection impossible to ignore. My hands were raw from labor, smeared with dust, oil, and paint, and yet a thrill coursed through me, the kind only a craftsman feels when confronting a challenge that demands every ounce of skill and ingenuity. Lunchtime brought an unexpected complication. The estate's original generator, designed to supply power to the sprawling property in case of outages, failed the moment I attempted to start it. Its ancient engine coughed and rattled, a mocking echo of the V12 Rolls-Royce I had tamed weeks ago. I pried open the casing, and the smell of burnt insulation assaulted my senses. Rusted connections and corroded wiring suggested that a simple repair would be impossible. A full replacement would be necessary. Frustration threatened to creep in, but I reminded myself of Matilda's words: anticipate setbacks and act decisively. I called the specialized supplier she had recommended, coordinating the delivery of replacement parts while simultaneously improvising temporary solutions to keep critical systems functional. The problem-solving demanded not just technical skill but diplomacy, as the local workers assisting me grew impatient with the generator's temperamental behavior. Balancing their temperaments with my own mounting stress tested my patience and resilience in ways I had never encountered before. By late afternoon, the first major phase of restoration showed visible progress. The exterior had been partially cleaned, structural concerns documented and temporarily stabilized, and critical utilities rendered operational. The estate was beginning to breathe again, though the scars of neglect were still painfully visible. I paused on the main lawn, surveying my efforts, feeling a rare mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The estate was beginning to transform under my hands, yet I knew that true restoration would require months, perhaps even years, of meticulous attention. It was then that Matilda reappeared, her presence quiet but commanding. She walked slowly across the grounds, her gaze scanning my work, pausing occasionally to nod in approval or frown at a detail I had overlooked. "You are progressing well," she said at last, her voice cutting through the afternoon air like a bell. "But remember, Mr. Callahan, restoration is not just about fixing what is broken. It is about understanding the spirit of the place, respecting its history, and anticipating its future." I nodded again, absorbing the full weight of her expectations. This was no longer a mere job. It was a mission, a test of character, skill, and vision all rolled into one. Every decision, every repair, every choice carried weight far beyond what I had ever encountered in my garage or on any project before. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the estate, I realized that the day had been a trial not just of skill, but of endurance and determination. The first setbacks had been overcome, yet the challenges ahead promised to be even greater. And in that moment, I felt a profound sense of purpose, a knowledge that every drop of sweat, every ache in my muscles, every decision made under pressure was contributing not only to the restoration of the Harrington estate, but to a transformation in how the family perceived me. By nightfall, I was exhausted, my body aching and my mind alert with anticipation of the days to come. Lillian appeared, carrying a simple meal and a reassuring smile. "You've done well today," she said softly. "Tomorrow will bring new challenges, but I know you're ready." I ate in silence, reflecting on the day's work. The estate had begun its resurrection, and with it, my own reputation within the Harrington family. The road ahead would be long, fraught with setbacks and tests of skill and character. But as I looked out across the estate, bathed in the silver light of the rising moon, I felt a rare and exhilarating certainty. I had stepped into a challenge worthy of my talents, and I would meet it head-on, no matter the cost. The morning fog rolled across the Harrington estate, lending a ghostly atmosphere to the sprawling grounds as I made my way to the carriage house. The faint crunch of gravel under my boots seemed louder than usual, each step echoing like a drumbeat announcing the beginning of another grueling day. The work ahead promised new challenges, but today, I sensed, would be different. Not simply because of the physical labor involved, but because of the subtle, often invisible resistance that awaited me from those who believed they held ownership not just of property, but of narrative. As I approached the main house, I noticed James Harrington, Matilda's eldest grandson, standing near the front terrace with a scrutinizing expression. He was dressed impeccably, every crease of his tailored suit in perfect alignment, but the rigid set of his jaw and the way he held his hands behind his back betrayed a simmering disapproval. From the moment he opened his mouth, it was clear that he had little interest in my presence beyond assessing the potential threat I posed to his carefully curated world. "You're early," he said, his voice clipped, measured. "I suppose that's good. Or maybe you just couldn't resist the chance to show off your skills again." There was a venomous undertone that hinted at far deeper insecurities, an unspoken challenge to me and my competence. I simply nodded, keeping my response neutral, aware that confrontation was useless at this stage. Today, I had to let work speak louder than words. The crew I had hired to assist with the restoration arrived shortly after, a motley collection of carpenters, electricians, and laborers whose own personalities added unpredictable layers to an already tense environment. Some were skeptical, others outright dismissive of the estate's grandeur and my unconventional methods. The tension was palpable. Even the air seemed heavier, infused with a sense of expectation and doubt. Our first task was to address the main hall's deteriorating ceiling. Years of water damage had left intricate plasterwork crumbling, exposing wooden laths and rusted nails. My plan was methodical: secure temporary supports, remove the damaged sections, and then begin the meticulous process of restoration. I led the crew in setting up scaffolding, measuring carefully, explaining each step with precision. Yet even as I spoke, murmurs of discontent rippled through the group. Some questioned the order of operations, others openly mocked my insistence on precision over speed. I felt my patience stretch thin, but I reminded myself of Matilda's words: anticipate setbacks and act decisively. Every critique, every moment of resistance, was an opportunity to assert not authority, but competence. I moved among the team, demonstrating the techniques, correcting mistakes with a steady hand, and gradually, the tension began to ease. By midday, the first sections of the ceiling had been reinforced, and the crumbling plaster removed without incident. Then came the unanticipated revelation. A hidden cavity above the main hall contained evidence of past alterations, blueprints, journals, and letters carefully tucked away decades ago. As I examined the papers, I realized they contained the original architect's notes, instructions for features that had never been completed, and detailed correspondence with Matilda herself during the house's initial construction. The discovery was a revelation, offering insight into the estate's true character, its intended grandeur, and the delicate balance of aesthetics and function that had guided its creation. I shared the discovery with the crew, explaining the significance, and suddenly, the skepticism began to fade. The magnitude of what we were restoring became tangible. Even James Harrington, who had been a persistent shadow throughout the morning, appeared momentarily struck by curiosity. He leaned over the papers, his previously imperious demeanor softened by the undeniable gravity of history in his hands. Yet resistance persisted in subtler ways. Certain laborers continued to undermine my authority, questioning methods or suggesting shortcuts. Each time, I maintained a composed demeanor, focusing on precision, integrity, and the lessons embedded in the architecture itself. Slowly, day by day, the crew began to align with the vision, recognizing that restoration was as much about respect for craftsmanship as it was about completing tasks efficiently. By late afternoon, we moved to the estate's west wing, notorious for its crumbling balconies and warped floors. Here, the challenges multiplied exponentially. Rotting support beams, hidden termite damage, and warped floorboards made navigation hazardous. Every decision was a balancing act between safety, authenticity, and the urgency to produce visible progress. My muscles ached from lifting, measuring, and stabilizing, but the thrill of overcoming each obstacle fueled my determination. As evening approached, Matilda arrived once again, her presence serene but authoritative. She moved through the property with the air of someone intimately familiar with its every corner. "You have begun to awaken the estate," she said, her voice calm but imbued with unmistakable weight. "You have faced resistance and uncertainty and prevailed. But the greatest tests are yet to come. This house has been neglected by generations, and only those who persist with patience and vision can truly restore it." I nodded, recognizing the implicit warning. The path ahead would test not only skill but endurance, leadership, and diplomacy. Already, I could see the subtle ways the Harrington family members had been influenced by my presence. Curiosity replacing disdain, skepticism shifting toward cautious respect. Yet, I knew that ultimate victory was not mine until the entire family acknowledged the value I brought, not just as a craftsman, but as a person of integrity and vision. Night fell over the estate, the sprawling grounds bathed in the silvery light of a rising moon. I walked the property alone, my hands blackened by the day's labor, my mind racing with plans for the following day. The estate was beginning to breathe again, slowly, hesitantly, yet unmistakably. The foundation was set, both in the physical sense and in the relationships forming quietly amidst dust and sweat. I realized that resistance, though exhausting, was necessary. It tested my resolve, honed my leadership, and revealed the depth of the challenge ahead. And as I returned to the carriage house, the cool night air brushing against my face, I felt an unusual sense of exhilaration. For the first time, I understood that true restoration was not merely about structures and aesthetics. It was about trust, respect, and the subtle art of earning one's place in a world that had once seemed entirely closed to me. Tomorrow, I knew, would demand even more ingenuity, patience, and courage. But for tonight, I allowed myself a brief moment of quiet satisfaction. The Harrington estate had begun its awakening, and I, against every expectation and obstacle, was at the center of its resurrection. The sun rose over the Harrington estate, spilling gold across the rolling lawns, the carriage house, and the main residence. Morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and polished wood. I had planned my day meticulously, but deep down, I knew that plans often encountered unforeseen obstacles, especially when dealing with a structure as intricate and aged as this mansion. I started in the east wing, a section of the house that had been neglected for decades. Years of water intrusion had weakened the timber, leaving floorboards unstable and ceilings ready to collapse with the slightest provocation. I was aware of the dangers, yet exhilaration surged through me. This was exactly the kind of challenge that both terrified and thrilled me. Precision, patience, and vigilance were now more critical than ever. By mid-morning, I had begun the careful process of replacing rotted beams with freshly cut oak supports, each piece carefully measured, aligned, and secured. The team worked efficiently, their movements now synchronized after days of guidance, demonstrations, and subtle encouragement. Yet, even in this improved atmosphere, unease lingered. Every step I took was cautious. Every adjustment carried the weight of potential catastrophe. Suddenly, a loud, resonant cracking sound echoed through the east wing, making my stomach drop. A section of ceiling, partially reinforced but still vulnerable, began to give way. Dust and debris fell like heavy rain, and I instinctively threw myself to the side, narrowly avoiding being struck. My heart hammered in my chest as I assessed the damage. The collapse was more severe than anticipated, exposing weakened joists and hidden water damage that threatened to undo hours of work. Panic fluttered briefly in my chest, but I suppressed it. This was a moment that demanded decisiveness. I shouted instructions to the team, directing them to stabilize the remaining structure, secure the area, and retrieve additional supports from the carriage house. Adrenaline surged through me as I moved among the workers, the weight of responsibility pressing down like a physical force. Then, through the haze of dust and tension, I noticed a figure emerging from the far end of the hall. She moved with the calm authority of someone accustomed to navigating chaos. It was Lydia Moreau, a renowned structural engineer and preservationist I had briefly met during a historical restoration conference years ago. Her sudden appearance was unexpected, yet her timing was perfect. "You'll want to brace that section immediately," she called, her voice cutting through the din like a blade. Without waiting for acknowledgement, she moved with swift precision, setting temporary supports and instructing the team on emergency stabilization techniques. Her expertise was evident in every action, years of experience distilled into movements and commands that were both efficient and exacting. I watched her work, absorbing every detail, every subtle maneuver, feeling a mixture of relief and awe. This was more than just assistance. It was an education, a masterclass in handling structural crises with intelligence, calm, and authority. She glanced at me, her sharp eyes assessing not just the damage, but my reaction to it. "You have skill, but don't underestimate the house," she said. "This structure has survived decades because of its design, not because it's forgiving to mistakes." Together, we coordinated the team, methodically addressing the most critical vulnerabilities. We replaced weakened joists, reinforced supports, and carefully cleared debris. Each movement required precision, each decision weighed heavily, yet progress was undeniable. By late afternoon, the east wing had been stabilized sufficiently to allow safe work, though full restoration was far from complete. Amid the labor, I noticed subtle shifts in the Harrington family's attitude. Matilda, observing from a balcony, nodded almost imperceptibly, an acknowledgement of competence and perseverance. James Harrington lingered nearby, his initial disdain tempered by cautious curiosity. Even Eleanor, previously rigid and dismissive, seemed to acknowledge the tangible results unfolding before her eyes, though she masked it behind a carefully maintained expression of neutrality. As we prepared to leave for the day, Lydia turned to me. "You've got resilience, skill, and the willingness to take responsibility," she said. "That combination will carry you far here. But remember, this house will test you in ways you cannot anticipate. And so will the family." Her words lingered as I walked the quieting estate grounds, the setting sun casting long shadows over the restored portions of the mansion. The day had begun with fear, threatened with disaster, and ended with a hard-won victory. Small, yet significant. I realized that true restoration required more than technical skill. It demanded adaptability, composure under pressure, and the ability to navigate unpredictable variables with confidence and integrity. That night, I sat alone in the carriage house, reviewing the day's events. My hands were blackened from the labor, my clothes streaked with dust, yet an undeniable sense of accomplishment thrummed within me. The mansion was revealing its secrets slowly, teaching me its history, its vulnerabilities, and its resilience. And though the Harrington family still posed their subtle challenges, their scrutiny now carried an undercurrent of respect that had been absent before. As darkness fell, I realized that the unexpected crisis had been more than a physical challenge. It had been a revelation. It had shown me the limits of my skill, the depth of my resolve, and the importance of allies in moments of uncertainty. Tomorrow, I knew, would bring new challenges, new obstacles, and perhaps new opportunities. But for now, I allowed myself a brief sense of triumph. Against all odds, amidst dust, debris, and the shadow of skepticism, I had prevailed. The mansion, silent and imposing in the moonlight, seemed to breathe around me, as if acknowledging the effort, the care, and the determination invested within its walls. And in that quiet, profound moment, I understood that the road ahead, though arduous, was one I was ready to traverse with courage, skill, and unwavering resolve. The following morning, a heavy fog clung to the Harrington estate, draping the mansion in a ghostly veil. I stepped outside, inhaling the cold, damp air, feeling the crunch of frost beneath my boots. Today's mission was clear. The West Wing, long sealed off and largely untouched, awaited restoration. Unlike the East Wing, which had exposed structural weaknesses, this part of the house was a puzzle wrapped in layers of history, its secrets hidden beneath years of dust, decay, and deliberate concealment. I pushed open the heavy double doors with a groan of protest, the hinges echoing through the cavernous hall. Dust motes floated like tiny specters in the pale morning light filtering through stained glass windows. The room I entered was massive, with high ceilings and walls lined with faded tapestries depicting unfamiliar landscapes and armored figures. Each step stirred the scent of old wood, mildew, and forgotten memories. As I moved through the room, I noticed something unusual, a small, ornately carved panel set into the floorboards near the fireplace. My curiosity sparked. I knelt down and pressed against it. To my surprise, it gave way with a soft click, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling into darkness. My heart raced. This wasn't just a hidden room. It was a time capsule, a part of the house that had been deliberately concealed. I descended carefully, each step creaking beneath my weight, the air growing cooler and more oppressive as I went deeper. At the bottom, I found a small chamber, dimly lit by a single crack of sunlight from a tiny, dust-streaked window. The room smelled of old paper and cedar. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with leather-bound journals, aged letters, and a curious assortment of locked boxes. Everything in the room exuded an aura of secrecy, of stories deliberately kept from prying eyes. I approached the nearest journal, its leather cover brittle and cracked with age. Opening it, I discovered entries written in a precise, almost meticulous hand. The handwriting belonged to none other than Samuel Harrington, the family patriarch, whose reputation for rigid control and ruthless decision-making had been whispered about in local circles for decades. The entries revealed a side of him I could never have anticipated: doubts, regrets, and most surprisingly, acts of kindness and compassion, often hidden from the public eye. Hours passed as I sifted through the documents. Each piece I uncovered painted a more complex portrait of the Harrington family. There were letters exchanged with estranged relatives, records of charitable donations never publicly acknowledged, and meticulous notes detailing the care of long-forgotten art collections. But then I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold: a series of correspondences hinting at a hidden trust, one that held significant influence over local businesses, political connections, and even the fate of several families in the region. The implications were staggering. As I read, I realized that the very foundation of the Harrington legacy was more than just wealth. It was control, influence, and a carefully maintained narrative. This trust, hidden from public scrutiny, suggested that the family wielded power far beyond what anyone, including their closest acquaintances, could imagine. My mind raced. Here I was, a mechanic turned craftsman, navigating the physical restoration of the mansion, and now I was privy to secrets that could reshape the very dynamics of this family's influence. The tension was interrupted by the sudden sound of footsteps above me. I froze, heart hammering, unsure if I had been discovered. Slowly, a shadow fell across the entrance to the hidden chamber. It was James Harrington, Sophia's older brother, the one who had been outwardly indifferent but quietly observant. His eyes scanned the room, landing on me with a mix of astonishment and calculated curiosity. "You found it," he said, voice low, almost a whisper, as if acknowledging a shared conspiracy. "Not many have. It's been hidden for a reason." I swallowed, realizing the gravity of the moment. I was no longer just a visitor, a young man attempting to impress a family with skill and diligence. I was now entangled in their deepest secrets, the custodial knowledge of power, influence, and legacy. Every decision I made from this point forward carried consequences I could barely comprehend. James moved closer, gesturing to the journals. These are dangerous in the wrong hands," he said. "They could ruin the family if anyone outside this house ever learned the truth. You need to understand that what you've uncovered isn't just historical curiosity. It's leverage, and with leverage comes risk." I nodded, the weight of responsibility settling over me like the very dust that coated the chamber. Suddenly, the project was no longer just about restoration or earning respect. It was about trust, secrecy, and navigating a labyrinth of influence I had never been prepared for. 4 hours, James and I worked together, carefully sorting through the documents, discussing their significance, and deciding what needed immediate attention. In that hidden room, amidst centuries of accumulated history and power, I realized that my role in the Harrington estate had transformed dramatically. I wasn't merely restoring walls and ceilings. I was becoming a keeper of their secrets, a silent guardian of truths that could alter destinies. By nightfall, we emerged from the hidden chamber, the estate bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun. The revelations weighed heavily on my mind, but there was also a quiet sense of purpose. I now understood that my journey with the Harringtons was far more intricate than I had anticipated. Restoration, respect, and revelation were intertwined in ways I could never have imagined, and the choices I made from this point forward would determine not just the future of the mansion, but my own place within the fragile, complex web of power that defined the Harrington legacy. As I walked through the halls, the weight of the day pressing against my shoulders, I knew one thing with absolute clarity: the next step would be the most challenging yet. The secrets I had uncovered were dangerous, alluring, and transformative, and tomorrow I would face the Harrington family in a way I had never done before. Not as a mechanic, not as a craftsman, but as someone who now held a piece of their very soul in my hands. The next morning, the Harrington estate was cloaked in an uneasy calm. I felt the weight of yesterday's discoveries pressing on my shoulders as I moved through the grand halls. Every polished surface, every glint of sunlight on the marble reminded me of the hidden truths I now carried. Today, I would face the family again, but this time with knowledge that could shift the balance of power, subtly but irrevocably. Sophia met me at the top of the grand staircase, her expression a mixture of concern and quiet determination. I could see the question in her eyes, the one unspoken yet pressing. "Are you ready?" I nodded, though my stomach twisted with anxiety. My hands were clean, my clothes pristine, yet I carried a far heavier burden than grease or dirt. In the dining room, the family had gathered. James gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod from across the table, signaling acknowledgement of the secrets we now shared. Matilda Harrington sat at her usual place of authority, her eyes scanning me with that familiar, piercing insight. Today, I realized, was not about earning approval. It was about proving integrity, courage, and the ability to act decisively even under scrutiny. Richard and Eleanor, still oblivious to the depth of my knowledge, maintained their cold, aristocratic composure. But as the conversation began, subtle shifts occurred. My observations about the mansion's hidden chambers, the careful care of the family's heirlooms, and my insights into the estate's historical documents revealed a competence they had never anticipated. Their disdain softened, replaced by a cautious curiosity. I spoke carefully, highlighting the importance of preservation, the value of understanding their legacy, and, without revealing too much, the significance of secrecy and trust. Matilda watched, silent but approving, as Richard and Eleanor's rigid expressions slowly gave way to acknowledgement. The power dynamics had shifted, not with confrontation, but through demonstrated expertise, responsibility, and respect for what they held dear. By the end of the meal, the family's attitude had changed, not entirely softened, but tempered with a grudging respect. Matilda's final words, spoken to me quietly as we walked through the grand hallway, resonated deeply. "True value is not in wealth or appearances, Mark. It is in what one chooses to protect, and how one chooses to act when no one else is watching." For the first time, I felt that I belonged, not as an outsider or a mere guest, but as someone whose skills, integrity, and courage had earned a place in the family's inner circle. The Harrington estate was no longer just a challenge of restoration. It had become a testament to trust, character, and the quiet power of doing what is right, even when it seems impossible. Evening settled over the Harrington estate like a velvet curtain, the last rays of sun glinting off the sprawling mansion's many windows. I stood on the terrace, looking out over the perfectly manicured gardens, feeling the weight of the past day's trials lift from my shoulders. The transformation wasn't just in the house. It was in me, and, surprisingly, in the Harrington family. Matilda approached quietly, her presence commanding yet gentle. Her eyes, sharp and knowing, held a spark of approval I had never earned before. "Mark," she said, her voice carrying the weight of authority and subtle warmth, "you've proven more than skill. You've proven character, integrity, courage. You understand the value of preservation, not just of things, but of trust, of people, of legacy." I felt a swell of emotion, a mix of relief and pride. For so long, I had feared judgment, ridicule, and rejection, but standing there, I realized none of that mattered anymore. Matilda's quiet endorsement had shifted everything. Even Richard and Eleanor, though still formal, acknowledged me with respectful nods I would never have expected days ago. The subtle tension in the air had dissipated, replaced by an unspoken acknowledgement of what had been earned. Sophia appeared at my side, her smile bright and genuine. "You did it," she whispered, the words carrying relief, admiration, and love all at once. I could see in her eyes that she had been holding her breath, hoping I would rise to the impossible challenge her family represented. Together, we walked through the grand hallways, past the restored chambers, the hidden rooms, and the treasures I had come to know intimately. The mansion no longer felt like a fortress of judgment. It felt like a home, a place where skill, courage, and integrity were respected above wealth or status. Later, in the grand dining room, Matilda took her seat, gesturing for me to join her. The seat at her right hand, the seat of honor, once reserved only for those born into influence, was now mine. I understood, in that moment, that acceptance didn't come from appearances or words. It came from actions, from choosing to act rightly, even when no one else could see. As we sat together, surrounded by the family I had once feared and now understood, I realized the true reward wasn't accolades or recognition. It was belonging. Belonging earned through patience, skill, courage, and the simple but profound act of doing what's right. The Harringtons were no longer distant arbiters of my worth. They were witnesses to it, and I to theirs. The evening faded into night, and I felt an unexpected calm. Challenges had been met, prejudices confronted, and secrets honored. I had arrived as an outsider, a humble mechanic with grease under his nails and a heart full of hope. I would leave, if I ever left, as a trusted member of a family whose respect could not be bought, only earned. And for the first time in my life, I felt entirely, irrevocably at home.